and Adolescent Psychiatry Fellowship. So as you can see, he's very busy, and that's why we're really appreciative. And anyone that knows Dr. Russell will tell you that he has great rapport with his patients. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Russell.
All right, thank you very much. And thanks everybody for having me. I'm excited to impart some knowledge with you over the next few sessions. And I'm hoping by the end of this 4-part series, you can all walk away feeling a bit more comfortable navigating what are two really complicated systems in our state. And what's even more complicated is how they intersect with each other, which is a lot of what the focus of this talk, this series will be about. So the sessions will be in 4 parts. I'm just trying to get my, there we go. They'll be in 4 parts. Today, we're going to focus on attachment and development, and I'll go into some more specifics about what we'll be talking about within that session. Our second session will focus on the mental health side of things between child welfare and mental health. The third session will be looking at how the two systems intersect, and we'll go over some resources. And then the last session will be less about me talking and more about other experts talking. We're going to have a diverse panel of experts from across the state who can answer questions regarding the material that we discussed in the first 3 sessions and any other questions that you all can think of. So if while we're going through these presentations, if you think of a question that you'd like us to kind of go into more detail about, feel free to submit it, and we'll bring that up during our panel discussion, which will be the last session. Just a couple of ground rules, and these will apply to all of the presentations. I am not going to answer any questions that are regarding medications or treatment plans of a specific child, nor will I answer any questions or make any comments about the treatment plans of other healthcare providers. If those questions come up, my answer is going to be go talk to that provider. Hypotheticals are okay. So if there's a hypothetical question that you want to bring up, we can do that. I'm just not going to speak on any specifics for different treatment providers or kids because every situation is unique, and I simply would not have the medical knowledge necessary to make an informed decision or a recommendation for a specific case. So today, we're going to be talking about attachment and development. So by the end of this session, hopefully, you'll learn a little bit more about the normal attachment process, as well as the different potential attachment styles that we as human beings can develop. We're going to talk about how the experiences of children in the foster care system can disrupt that attachment process, as well as other areas of development. And then we're going to take those 2 pieces and we're going to apply it to something called the strange situation, which I will explain a little bit later on. And then finally, we're going to talk about what happens and what becomes of these children after they exit the foster care system and enter adulthood. So before I start talking, I want to have you all share some thoughts with me. So we're going to put you all into breakout groups, and you're going to have about 4 to 5 minutes to talk about these 2 questions, which is, what does the term attachment mean to you? And how comfortable are you with the concept? So you'll all go into breakout groups. I would like, if possible, for there to be 1 representative from each group who will agree to potentially share some information from what the group discusses. And then when we all come back, I'm going to ask those group representatives to put some thoughts in the chat for me.
So we're starting with this now. We're going to break them out now, correct?
Yep.
Okay. Someone's asking me how. So you were going to see something that says join, click on that. And it should bring you in. And then it should close out in about 5 minutes. So does everybody see that? Okay, I don't know. Somebody did it ahead of me, so I don't know who said that.
Looks like
Mm.
most people have joined, but it looks like there's a few that are unassigned.
Okay. Should have done it automatically. Don't see.
I'll see if I can throw them into different rooms.
Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah, I don't know why they just didn't go in.
I'm going to take care of them and make sure their life is good while I'm running it. So I'm very comfortable with it.
I guess attachment to me just means bonding and support and safety. I guess I'm comfortable with the concept. I don't know how comfortable I am explaining attachment, but
Mhm. For me, it's closeness and sharing, trusting, loving. And I'm very comfortable with it, with attachments.
Yeah, I think simply put, it's some sort of emotional bond that connects individuals to one another. That our only prompt? Is there another question?
nope, it's just how comfortable are you and what does it mean to you?
Describing it or just in general?
You know what? It was really vague and I'm not really sure.
Oh, we got 5 minutes to fill the void of silence. So.
Who wants to be the representative?
Not me.
I'll do it.
All right. How's everyone's day?
Mine was busy, very busy.
That can be good or bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was cooking all day, so I'm a chef. So
Oh.
Oh. Tell
I
me
get
more
that.
about your day and the good food then.
well, I cooked a lot today. 60 gallons of sauce. Let's see.
Oh, geez.
Yeah, we do a lot there. And it's tough with the kids, but we're gonna get through this. And it's like I just wish mom and dad would wake up, so they could be with their, mom and dad, instead of being with papa. But I've had them for 3 years, each of them 3 years, so that's
I have one too, but
Yeah.
mine, he's 17 now, and I had him 3 months old.
oh, God
Wow.
bless you. Wow,
Yeah.
God bless you. Yes.
Yeah.
And
And
see, and that's the thing. You want to make sure that they're going to grow up right and they're going to be on the right track instead of
Absolutely.
following mom and dad's footsteps.
it's what you do though. Mine's is on the right track. He's 17. He graduated already from high school, his core classes, and he takes culinary. So he's
Wow.
got to finish that in June. He works at Outback and a nursing home.
Good.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, tell them to get out of culinary. I've
Tell
been
him
in
to
it
get out of
35
it.
years. Yeah, I've been in it 35 years.
He
It's
likes
just going to get worse now.
He loves it. I don't know if I could talk him out of it. I asked him, is he sure?
Yeah, because it's every weekend, it's every holiday, and it's all
It's a
nights.
24/7
Yep,
operation. Yeah, I know.
yep. 35 years I've been doing it. And I've opened restaurants, I've closed restaurants, I've taught everybody I could. Oh, break's gonna be over soon. Well, look at
Okay.
that. We got through the first one, folks. Good job.
Nice meeting you
It
guys.
was nice
Yeah.
meeting you guys as well.
If you were designated the the scribe or reporter for your group. If you wouldn't mind just putting down whatever kind of the main points your group talked about, just put it.
What did I just do? Did I just mute you? I'm sorry.
Dr. Russell, you'd like us to put them in the chat?
Yep.
Okay.
Just a couple of thoughts, whatever the main point or two was that your group talked about.
Oh, I'm glad you said that, Kathleen. Thanks, because we just got back here, so I wouldn't have heard that otherwise. All
Yep.
right.
On our next breakout session, could we put the questions in the chat?
Yes,
Because we remembered the first one. We couldn't remember the second one.
not a problem. I'll make sure they get in there.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I mean, I was asked to, you know, to speak about what we, you know, what we shared, but I don't even know the group we were attached to, but I'll still put what we.
Yep,
put down
that's
for our main
okay.
points.
That's okay.
Okay.
I just want to collect a few thoughts that we're gonna discuss a little bit more.
Okay.
Yep, and if
Thank
you
you.
were with me, if you were with Kathleen Liedtke, I am going to, I'd mentioned I would put them in the chat for your group.
All right, so far, we've got bond between the child and caregiver. Mm-hmm. So I'm seeing a lot of themes here about a bond. And, you know, building trust, security, comfort. So let's see. Emotional connection between a child and an adult. Yep. Okay. Susan, you noted here that an attachment can be positive and negative. Can you say a little bit more about that, or what your group talked about related to that?
That was actually someone within our group. And I'm sorry that I don't, when I had 4 people, I could have told you who it was, but right now I can't.
That's
So if
okay.
you'd like to, thank you.
Yeah, like you can have codependent relationships or relationships where, or I guess attachments where people support negative pieces in your life versus bringing strength, positivity, and helping like build you up.
Mm-hmm.
Positive.
So if hypothetically a child was, you know, had a relationship with a caregiver that kind of veered more towards some of those negative points that you pointed out, anyone have a thought on what that might look like as the child aged? Like how might that look in a school-age child versus a teenager versus a young adult? Eugenia, you have a thought? Go ahead.
It could be unhealthy because if anybody who says something, it can be easily manipulated, the child, in any situation, if it has unhealthy attachments in their initial core. So if someone says, okay, you're like, for a young lady, okay, you're beautiful, that can lead to so much into that, to, you know, dangers with drugs, dangers with sex, rape, I mean, trafficking, so many things. Well, males too, but I'm saying so many things that come out of that because of not having a healthy attachments. So yeah, I say as a teenager or a young child.
Right. And Robin, you had your hand up too. Go ahead.
I think it's definitely looking at the other side of it, because when we think of attachment, we always think about building healthy relationships. But yes, the concept of building unhealthy relationships, i.e. the anxious child, the child that can't leave their parent, has trouble breaking away for daycare, for, you know, little things like that. That's a child that is not forming healthy relationships necessarily.
So the other thing that I noticed about the responses, which are all fantastic, where there are a lot of consistency with some of the buzzwords. So we're seeing, you know, trust, consistent, reliable. if somebody walked up to you and asked you to tell them what attachment was, do you feel like you would be able to fully convey what it means to somebody who had no idea about the topic?
Maybe.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of like, I don't know, right? And I'm gonna be honest, I'm with you on that. And that's part of the point of this discussion. Attachment, I think on the surface, folks, and this runs the gamut from people with no experience with child development to professionals who work with it for decades. Superficially, we can have a decent idea of what it is, but when it comes down to like the details, it's really hard to explain what it is. And to a certain extent, we have to acknowledge that we don't have a great sense of what attachment is, because it's a psychological and emotional experience, even though it has it has neurobiological ties to it. But that makes it difficult when it comes to trying to work with folks on strengthening attachment, because nobody's going to have a really great way to explain it. And as you'll see with this next slide, these are 3 different definitions of attachment by, one by the founder of attachment, basically, the father of attachment research, John Bowlby, one by the American Psychological Association, and one from a website that, tries to package psychological topics into, digestible language for the lay public. And there's certain pieces that are consistent within all of them, but the definitions themselves are very different. And Bowlby, I think he's able to boil it down into a short definition, a lasting psychological connectedness between human beings. But even I couldn't tell you what exactly that means, right? In the broad sense of things, I can understand what that means, but I couldn't actually tell you in detail what that means. So it's a complex topic, and it's important, I think, that we all acknowledge that it is. One piece of information that I think is useful is understanding from a neurobiological standpoint, there is actually a point in time where attachment goes through a critical development stage. And that's around 6 to 12 months old. It's not right when the baby is born. So even if a baby is born is immediately like being held by their mother or father, whoever their caregiver is, there is not automatically an attachment that's developed at that point. It happens later on. And there's a difference in the child's development if the attachment is disrupted during this critical window between 6 and 12 months, or if it happens before or after that. If it happens during this period of time, the consequences are much more widespread for the child. So attachment, again, and this is one of those questions where we can say like, yeah, we understand attachment is important, but why? And one big piece of it is essentially the first building block for development, particularly social and emotional development. If a child has a secure attachment, and we'll talk more about what secure attachment means in a little bit. If they have a secure attachment with their caregiver, that means they have the base, the scaffold to create relationships, manage changes or stressors that come up with in their lives, and learn how to regulate their feelings. Without that secure attachment to provide that scaffold at the beginning, all of these things get disrupted. Having a secure attachment allows the child essentially a home base to explore their world. The child can go out and try new things and meet new people and experience things because they know they can always come back to that caregiver who is going to protect them. And that's, of course, going into it. That's where trust is established. And trust came up a lot of times in that breakout group. And that is absolutely correct. That trust is an essential outgrowth of a strong attachment. Another way to think about it is like this. if we think about babies coming into the world with a handbook, rule number one about the world would be like setting the stage for whether the world can be trusted and why. So babies who develop secure, strong attachments learn that they are safe so they can explore their world. And the reason they can explore it is because they have somebody who keeps them safe. And that attachment figure doesn't have to be mom or dad. It can be literally anybody that the child develops an attachment to. It can be a grandparent, it could be another relative, it could be a foster or adoptive parent, it can be lots of different people. If they don't have that, the first rule they learn about the world is that it's not safe and they can't rely on anyone else to keep them safe. So if you think about that, if that's the rule the child is basing everything off of, they're going to expend all of their developmental energy to try to keep themselves safe because they can't rely on anybody else to do it for them. Whereas that child that knows that they're safe can use their developmental energy and their biological energy that goes with it to develop other skills and grow physically so that they can be healthier down the line. So now when it comes to the experiences that children in the foster care system go through that affect attachment, there's a few that are pretty obvious or well known, and that's neglect and abuse. Neglect is the number one reason that children are removed from their homes by Child Protective Services. They account for about 60% of those cases. Another 20 to 30% are related to different types of abuse. But then there's other ways that attachment can get disrupted. And sometimes these kids enter the child welfare system and sometimes they don't. And that is simply that the child does not have the availability to develop an attachment, or that availability gets disrupted by something. So for example, if a parent passes away, if a parent undergoes a chronic medical illness and is not physically or emotionally available for the child, if their caregivers are working all the time, all of those can lead to a poor attachment, because when it comes down to it, one of the key ingredients to developing an attachment is time and presence. And certainly with those first couple of examples, it's pretty obvious to understand how that didn't happen. But there's other more insidious ways in which it can happen. And the result can be almost the same for some kids. So building off of that, even though there are certain reasons where children get removed from a home and get put into foster care, those are obviously traumatic events, but so is the actual transition into foster care itself, even if you take out the precipitating event. And that's something that can get overlooked quite a bit. And each time a child transitions to a new home or a new placement, that's another trauma. There's so many changes each time a child is in a new placement. And it's not just getting to know their new home and their new family members living with them. They have to adjust to a new environment. Oftentimes they're at a new school. They might be in a completely different environmental setting. They might have lived in a rural area and now they're in the big city, or vice versa. They might have lived in a home where there was a playground down the street and now you have to drive 20 minutes to the nearest place to hang out with other kids. They might go from a school with a class of 10 to 15 kids and now there's 30 of them in each class. Those are all adjustments a child has to make on the fly almost immediately. And that's hard. And then also, they're not just meeting new people in the form of the people living with them. They have to make new friends. They might lose old friends because of where they move. They have to get to know new adults, new teachers, new providers potentially. They have to figure out what the extended family looks like. And with all of these changes, and if there's a repetitive pattern of moving to different places, there are certain thoughts that creep into these children's minds. And they're questions of safety and trust. Some kids internalize what's happening around them and make it about themselves. They think they're a bad person because I keep getting kicked out of all these homes. What's wrong with me? And some kids end up just assuming that the same thing's going to happen again, since it's already happened 2 or 3 times. These people will leave me too, just like everyone else. And all of these thoughts reinforce that lack of trust and safety. And so more energy gets diverted to those safety measures that are internal to the child. And then this too can create a negative cycle amongst the people who are taking these children in. So if you have a child that comes in already not trusting themselves or the world, they come in defensive, protective, ready to defend themselves. And those children will often look angry or withdrawn or irritable. And we'll talk more about that next session when we talk about attachment disorders. And then it can escalate to aggression and a poor relationship with their current caregivers. And then before you knew it, they're out of that home and in a new one. And then the cycle just repeats. So it's really important to acknowledge that even though a child being put into a new placement may, for a lot of reasons, be in their best interest, and that doesn't outweigh necessarily the need for that child to change placements, we have to keep in mind that placement has drawbacks and has consequences for these kids. So we're now going to pivot a little bit and talk about other areas of development that get disrupted by placement by disrupted attachment. So I have a question for all of you, and that question is, what % of brain development has typically occurred by the time a child is 5 years old? So I think we should have a way to put up a poll for you all to answer. There we go. So just click the answer you think it is, and let's see what we come up with.
Or 90%.
Okay, so we got a little bit of everything, but it sounds like most folks are leaning towards the higher numbers. It looks like a little bit more than half think it's at least 75, if not 90%. So, and you guys are right. If I can clear out of it, I'll show you it. So it's 90%.
Wow.
Think about that for a second. 90% of a human's brain development has happened by the time they're 5. That's an astronomical number. And it's because when a child is born, there's almost no connections there. So every single event in their lives is creating new connections. And there's so much information to take in those first few years of life. And so because of that, our brains have developed different goals at different points in our lives. So when we're kids, our goal is to just take in information and knowledge. And our brains just figure out where to put it somewhere. So we're forming all of these synapses, which is basically how that information is connected and stored. But all the most minute things are forming connections. And around the time a child is 3 to 4, kind of around when they start school, there's an explosion of these connections because there's an explosion of new experiences and knowledge that the child experiences. And I'm going to show you some slides of human brains at that age, and you're going to see the astounding difference. What you'll also notice is when we hit adolescence, the brain changes its task. It is less important about acquiring knowledge, because now there's this whole mess of information in our brains. And now our brains are trying to decide what information is useful to us. So the brain undergoes a process called synaptic pruning. So instead of building connections, our brains are actually losing connections. But it's losing connections that the brain has decided are not important to us. And that allows the connections that are important to become stronger. So for example, at 13, our brain may not need information related to how we used a pacifier when we were an infant. that information is now no longer relevant. It can go away. We don't need that, right? We need to know how we look cool in front of our friends. We need to know the social rules of engagement. Those tracks are going to get strengthened because of all the constant interaction we're having with our peers at school. So this slide shows like little snippets of a brain at birth, at the age of 6, and at the age of 14. So, you know, when we're born, there's not a whole lot there yet. We haven't made enough connections. We haven't experienced enough things. But if you look at the 6-year-old, which is the picture in the middle, it honestly looks like just this tangled mess of spider webs. There is so much more information there. And then by the time you get to the adolescent brain, which is the one on the right, there's fewer connections. And so the pathways are a little bit easier for our brains to navigate. So it's not always about our brains developing more and more and more connections as we get older. And because of that, if there's a disruption to a child's development in the earlier years when we're trying to acquire all this information, again, the consequences are far more widespread. So children will struggle in lots of different areas of development. Whereas if the disruption happens later in life, the disruption is more focused. So there might be more of a social ramification versus an intellectual versus an emotional ramification. Whereas if it's happening at a younger age, all of those areas can be affected. So the next slide is going to have a lot of stuff on it, but my point of this is not the details. But it is important I think, for us to have a basic understanding of how our stress response system works and how that gets disrupted if we undergo the kinds of stress and experiences that kids in the foster care system have typically undergone. So our stress response system is not always active. It is turned on when we experience a reason for it to be turned on, some kind of stress. It could be a whole lot of different things. And when that happens, our brain creates a hormone, which then travels around the body, creating more hormones, resulting in the production of a hormone called cortisol. And cortisol is what triggers the fight or flight response. So we experience a stressor, and then our body quickly reacts and develops cortisol so that we're ready to engage the situation. So, you know, back in the caveman days, this would be if you're out somewhere looking for food and you see a saber-toothed tiger, your body's ready to go. You are ready to defend or run or do whatever you need to do to stay alive. Now, the other important part about this system is just the same way, I should say the opposite way that a stressor from outside the system turns it on. The system is designed to turn itself off. So cortisol, in addition to triggering the fight or flight response, then goes back up to the brain and shuts off the stress response system. So that when the stress is over, the system shuts down. So the problem that happens for a lot of kids in the foster care system is they are undergoing chronic stress. So the stress never leaves. So just as quickly as the system is turning itself off, it's turning itself back on again because the stressor hasn't gone anywhere. So these kids have a stress response system that's basically active 24/7. And here's the problem with that. While cortisol is really good for engaging the flight or fight response, it also causes brain damage if there's too much of it.
Wow.
So if a child has had cortisol in their brain constantly, their brain development is going to get disrupted. And that also means the stress response system won't work properly later. So let's say you have a child that is in some kind of setting where they're experiencing stress all the time and the system is on all the time. And then they get removed and they go somewhere where the stress ends so the system can finally shut itself off. For many of those kids, it can't, at least not properly. And then it can't turn itself on again properly in the future when there are stressors. So the changes that happen to the stress response system explain a lot of symptoms and behaviors and feelings that these kids show down the line. So it's important to have a sense of just the basics for how this works. So now we're going to switch gears and talk a little bit more about attachment styles, as I had promised a little bit earlier. Feel free to shout this out. Does anyone know who this guy is? No guesses? So this is
I-
John Bowlby.
I want to guess.
Oh,
Is
okay.
that Bradenton?
So this is John Bowlby.
Oh, okay.
John Bowlby is considered the father of attachment research. So he is the one who first started to pay attention to the ways in which babies and their caregivers started to develop relationships and a sense of trust. And he developed a way for us to categorize the different types of attachments that kids can develop. And essentially, when we're looking at a healthy attachment, we call that a secure attachment. And so Bowlby developed these different categories based on two factors. One, the interactions between a caregiver and the child, kind of just day to day, what's the caregiving like? And the second piece is what that caregiver does when the child becomes distressed. So to develop a secure attachment with a caregiver, a child needs to experience both. They need to experience loving, sensitive caregiving, and that caregiver needs to respond the same way each time the child is distressed, or relatively the same way. Doesn't have to be exact. And different combinations of that caregiving and distress response from the caregiver can lead to different attachment styles. And there are some non-secure attachment styles that are called insecure, and there's different subtypes. And then there's some that are called disorganized. So this is all well and good, but then comes the question of like, how did we actually figure out what these attachment styles look like? So, does anyone know who this is? This is Mary Ainsworth. She was a student of Bowlby's. So she took Bowlby's idea and created a research protocol called the Strange Situation. It was used quite frequently shortly after it was developed. When you see the clips we're going to watch, you're going to see why it's not used regularly anymore, because it can be a distressing situation for the child. But essentially, Ainsworth created this protocol between a caregiver, the child, and a stranger to test what a child's attachment style is. So there's different combinations of those three people in an examination room, which is set up like a playroom. You'll see when we watch, because we're going to watch a few clips. And the exam room is the same. And there's going to be different combinations of the child, the caregiver, and the stranger in the room. And the child's responses to those people, as well as the changing situations, falls into predictable categories for different attachment styles. So what we're going to do next is we're going to watch 3 clips of kids undergoing the strange situation. One of those 3 clips demonstrates a secure attachment. So after we watch the videos, we're going to go back into breakout groups, and you guys are going to try to figure out which clip was that of a secure attachment. And then we'll see how you do. So if anyone's having trouble with the sound, let me know. I tested this earlier, so it should work. So here's our first clip.
And on here, on the side, should we make it wide? You're gonna try to put that on top? Oh, it's gonna fall. Oh, you're gonna put that way up on the top. Watch what's gonna happen. Lindsay. Timber. Hey. What do you have there? Board or squash? Show me that. Bianca. Hey, your shoes untied. Want me to tell you your shoe? Come to me. You should have John put in. Oops. It's okay if somebody takes care of this. Oh, yes. Oh.
Okay, that's the first one. Here's the second one.
I don't know if for anybody else, it's very laggy for me and I have very sporadic sound.
Me too.
Yeah, that's what happened. It was
Okay.
for me too.
Okay. Let's hope this one's a little bit better. Let me know if the same problem happens.
And telephone? Telephone? That's the most interesting thing you can find to bring from here. Yeah. Knots. Cool. Biggest thing on the brain. No, well, you never know from a phone like that, everything is pointless. I think it's not like, but I can see if I can do that.
Oops. That was my fault. Sorry. Was the sound any better?
No.
No? Okay. Okay. I think it might be the sheer number of people on the link. It's having trouble handling it. So why don't we do this? Because I can make sure that we can perhaps send the clips out to everybody, send the slides out to everybody, and you can watch them. But I think if everybody's having trouble hearing it, what we'll do is we're going to skip the breakout group and talk a little bit about what the strange situation tends to show in different attachment scenarios. So what is happening throughout these different clips is that there's, you have the child and the caregiver, they're playing. Then a stranger comes in and the three of them spend some time. The caregiver leaves and it's just the child and the stranger. The caregiver comes back and the stranger leaves again. And then everybody leaves. So it's just the child. And that's the critical part of the protocol. And the child's reaction there tells us a lot. And it is not that the child can handle the situation and doesn't give distress. In a secure attachment, because these are all toddlers, the child in a secure attachment will show distress with the fact that their caregiver left and they're alone. The next part is the stranger comes back in first and tries to comfort the child. And in a secure attachment, that isn't going to cut it. The child is still going to be upset until the caregiver comes back in. So, and then at that point, the child is relieved. They go to their caregiver. I mean, in this case, it was mom, and then they kind of go back to playing. So kids with secure attachments at that age will show distress. And that can sometimes be confusing because what you will see later on is there is a clip where there's a child who doesn't show distress no matter who's in the room. They seem cool as a cucumber. And that's actually the sign of an insecure avoidant attachment, where they don't seem to care who's in the room with them. And then what we didn't get to see with the second clip was what's called an insecure resistant attachment. So in an insecure resistant attachment, the child gets really dysregulated and really emotional once people leave. And then again, it doesn't matter when the stranger comes back in, they're still really upset. And then even when the caregiver comes back in, they're still really upset. And they can't seem to make up their mind about what to do with the caregiver being back. So they'll kind of like go towards them and then back off and start crying again. And then they'll try to go towards them again. And then they'll get upset again. So there's not that secure home base for the child. Now, I only had 3 clips. There is not a clip of a disorganized attachment, and there's a reason for that. And that's because what we have found is that disorganized attachments don't have a pattern. They just, there's disruption in some way. So it could be, you could have a child that shows, you know, no distress during one interaction with the caregiver coming in, and then the next time it happens, it's intense distress. Sometimes the kids will engage in like bizarre behaviors when people come and go. So there is no concrete expected behavior with a disorganized attachment. And one thing to keep in mind is that the child's environment does not necessarily guarantee a certain attachment. So just like we talked about how you could have a child that's in their biological home with both of their presents together and married, and they can still develop an insecure attachment, you could have a child that, you know, maybe does get removed from their home and goes into an adoptive or foster placement, and they can still develop a secure attachment. It may be with the foster or adoptive caregiver, but they can still form an attachment. So there's not a guarantee that a particular environmental situation will lead to a certain attachment. However, there is risk involved. So kids that end up in the child welfare system are about 5 times more likely to have a disorganized attachment than a child who does not go through the child welfare system. So our environment does make a difference. It's just not set in stone. That's the point I want to make about this. So the last main concept that I want to talk about today, before we kind of open it up for questions, is talking about what these kids look like as they enter adulthood, depending on their attachment style. And oftentimes, a child's attachment style predicts how they're going to view the world and themselves, especially if they don't receive treatment. Now, if they receive treatment, that prognosis can change. And we'll talk about that a lot more next session, because there's a lot of different ways that we treat attachment disorders. But this graph is kind of like, here's what happens if a child doesn't receive treatment and they have a certain attachment style. And it's kind of based on 2 planes. One is the child or now adult's view of themselves, and the other is their view of the world around them. Now, if someone has had a secure attachment, they are more likely to have a positive view of themselves and a positive view of the world around them, which allows them to interact with that world more independently. If they had an insecure attachment, one of those 2 areas is disrupted. So for kids that have an insecure, resistant attachment style as adults, these folks may have an okay view of themselves, but they're not going to have a good view of the world, or sorry, they're going to have a good view of others, but they're not going to have a good view of themselves. They're going to have poor self-esteem, a low sense of self-worth. It's going to be hard for them to advocate for themselves. Kids with an insecure, avoidant attachment grow up to have a decent view of themselves, but a very negative view of the world around them, which breeds a sense of mistrust with that world. And then kids with disorganized attachments usually struggle in both realms. So this is why, you know, even though like the timing of treatment can make a difference for kids, if we recognize that there's a kid struggling with a certain attachment style, you know, any kind of treatment can prove to be helpful and try to steer them towards this secure path where they have a good view of themselves and the world around them so they can interact with it. There's actually a lot of data that's been gathered through a couple of large-scale studies over the years about the additional risks that kids in foster care have to face as adults. And it's not just what would be obvious, more obvious, which is that they'd have more mental health problems. That's true, they do. But they also tend to have more chronic medical problems. they tend to graduate at a much lower rate than peers that did not go into the foster care system. And as we talked about before, some of that is because their stress response activity has been changed. Their stress response system does not work the way it was designed to work. And that has led to problems with development down the line. So these kids struggle a lot as adults. And we'll talk a little bit in the third session about some measures that are being taken to help give these kids support as young adults, so they're not just thrown out in the world when they turn 18. Because if that's the case, many of them are going to struggle greatly. So now that we've talked a bit about what attachment looks like, how attachment can be disrupted, and how that changes a child's trajectory for the rest of their lives, the next question is, how do we move a child's attachment style to something that's more secure? And that's going to be a major focus of what we talk about in the next session. So at this point, that's all I have for slides. And I think at this point, we'll open it up to questions. So if you want, you can put them in the chat. At this point, if you want to just shout them out, feel free. We'll try to get to as many as we can.
There are some in the chat, Jenny or Kathleen. I didn't know who was doing that.
So there's one question: is insecure resistant attachment the same as anxious attachment?
Yes. So it's been called both of those things. Insecure avoidant has been called insecure anxious. Both terms have been used. But I think mostly now folks will use the term insecure avoidant. But there are many who will, do insecure avoidance / anxious. So essentially that means the same thing.
And then someone followed that with, could this also be for a child on the spectrum?
Yes.
Yeah,
So,
I asked that.
Yeah. So attachment happens for every child, even if they have other comorbidities, whether they're physical, emotional, or developmental. So a child with autism will still develop an attachment of some kind if given the opportunity. And that can very well be, and many times it is a secure attachment. The child's developmental delay is not what determines the attachment style. It's how that caregiver interacts with the child. Now, sometimes because of the challenges that can happen with kids that have developmental delays, that changes the way in which caregivers will respond to those children, and that can change the attachment style. But it is not because the child has a developmental delay.
I have a question to that. I would like to know, is there any data on the foster care system with children that may have any type of neurodiverse condition and how they're placed or treated? Is there anything with that, or?
I would have to look into that a little bit more. I want to say the answer is yes, but I don't have any of that data off the top of my head.
All right.
But I'll look into that and see if I can find anything.
Thank you.
Okay.
And I know we have two hands raised, but I'm going to read this. Someone who is too attached and childish in approach and language to parents, what type of attachment is that?
So that would, that in of itself could happen in different attachment settings. So if someone is, overly attached to their parent, and so that might lead to, struggles with separation or intense emotions when there is separation, that's sometimes a sign of an insecure resistant attachment. Now, that could also be a child with a secure attachment who also has severe anxiety. So that behavior in and of itself doesn't mean that there's an attachment problem. As we'll talk about next time, part of what leads to someone being diagnosed with an attachment disorder is there's certain prerequisites that have to happen that basically say that child, for whatever reason, did not get a chance to develop a secure attachment. But if that type of behavior is going to show up in an attachment disorder or in a non-secure attachment, it's often insecure resistant.
And then I know there's one more question. I'm going to go in order. So Robin, do you want to ask your question?
So my question is, how much does temperament of the child play into attachment? And how much of, well, I lost the second part. I guess I'll just leave it at that. How much
Okay.
does temperament of the child play into ability to attach?
So I'm going to expand that a little bit. Everybody's temperament plays a role in it.
Right.
Kind of similar to how we talked about the situation with a child on the spectrum. You sometimes will have a child and a caregiver who are essentially a temperamental mismatch. So you might have a caregiver, maybe it's a caregiver that's gone through trauma themselves and has a very, short window of tolerance for frustration. They can't handle too much. And then you have a child that's very colicky as an infant, and they don't sleep well, and they constantly need, attention from the caregiver. And that kind of temperamental mismatch can affect what ends up being the attachment. Perhaps, that caregiver ends up kind of getting burnt out. They might struggle with postpartum depression themselves. And that, even though like this may be an intact family, and there's maybe that child wouldn't go on to develop a particular mental health diagnosis. The fact that there's just people starting at different spaces in terms of their emotional presets can impact the final attachment product, so to speak.
So in that case, is there certain child temperaments that maybe have more resilience towards attachment?
I'm not aware of any particular studies that have matched a temperament to resilience. I will say that kids that do show signs of resilience, even as youngsters, are more likely to develop secure attachments and are more likely to be successful in attachment-based treatment, even if they've undergone trauma or been removed. They're still removed from their biological home. They are more likely to develop secure attachments or improved attachments than kids that don't have markers of resilience.
Alfred, do you want to ask your question, and then I'll go back to the ones in the chat?
Yeah, thank you. So all the things that we're talking about right now, are these precursors or leading to like a reactive attachment disorder?
So reactive attachment the attachment disorders can result when there's disruptions in attachment. I say can because, again, it's not a one size fits all. There's a lot of different factors that will ultimately determine what a child's attachment style is to a caregiver. But there are lots of things all the things that we talked about that can disrupt attachment are risk factors for a child developing a non-secure attachment. And again, since a lot of those risk factors coincide with kids in the foster care system, that's why there's a 5 times higher risk of a child developing a disorganized attachment versus a child that hasn't been entered foster care. But those same risks can apply in other scenarios, not just kids who go into the foster care system.
Okay, and then Stacy, please chime in here, but you asked early on, thank you, Sue. Would this also apply when they are reunited after being in foster care for an extended period?
That's a great question. So as I mentioned early on, there's a certain point in development where attachment is supposed to happen, which is during that 6 to 12 month period. However, that's not the only time attachment can happen. It can happen after that. The difference is because it's not happening at a developmentally appropriate time, it's harder to do, and it doesn't always turn out exactly the way we would expect it. But it is possible for a child who was removed from their biological home and then is eventually reunited with them even years later to develop a secure attachment with their biological caregiver. Now, the vast majority of the time for that to happen, there needs to be some kind of attachment-based treatment, because it's not going to it's very hard to have it happen naturally, because we're past that developmental window where it's supposed to happen naturally. But attachments can be developed later, and we will see that. And we also see that, we can also see that it happens, it might take a while if a child is, say, permanently removed and with an adopted family. It can happen with that family, but it might take a while before it does. And again, when we talk about attachment-based treatments next time, those treatments are critical for helping any child develop a secure attachment if it's outside of the critical window.
So Deborah's asking, where does RAD come in?
So reactive attachment disorder, which is, spoiler alert, not the only attachment disorder anymore. There's now two. That comes in when we have a child who did not get the opportunity to develop a secure attachment and then develops a characteristic set of behaviors and interactions with the world that end up having significant impact on their functioning. And when we talk about those mental health diagnoses next time, the term functioning is going to come up a lot, because that is a necessary term to diagnose somebody with a disorder. So somebody can have a non-secure attachment and not meet criteria for reactive attachment disorder because perhaps this person is incredibly resilient and has developed a very functional life for themselves. But the way they they interacted with their caregivers was essentially not the way nature intended, but they were able to develop into a space where they're functioning well. And that person would not meet criteria for an attachment disorder, even if it was, confirmed that they had a non-secure attachment.
And then Eugenia is asking, is this a situation that can lead to abuse of the child?
When he
So,
was talking about the mismatch of the, having a baby who probably has colic or something and they're placed with someone who does not have the skill set and could be, sadly reacting off of that, don't know how to deal with that. That's what the question I was asking
Yes.
to when you were talking about that.
yeah, and the short answer is yes, it can. In that situation, the way the caregiver ends up reacting to that child, and it depends, again, there's a lot of factors that go into it. The caregiver might have their own past trauma, they might have their own mental health history or developmental history. They might just have a temperament that doesn't allow for a lot of frustration and challenge for them in terms of this area of life. And they could react in a way that ends up being neglectful or abusive.
Okay. Alex is asking, can attachment style change over time with intervention? And if so, what age would be the limit?
So the answer to the first part is yes. Attachment styles can change. There isn't a hard limit, but the general rule of thumb is the closer the child is to that critical developmental window, the easier it's going to be. So the younger, the better. And when we talk, you'll see when we talk about attachment-based or evidence-based attachment therapies, almost all of them are geared towards young children, because those children are more likely to respond because they're closer to the developmental window. So there are treatments available for older kids. There's just not as many of them, and they don't have as much evidence behind them because those kids are farther away from that developmental window. So it is harder for them to change attachment styles, but it is possible.
Yeah, and then he's saying also, can attachment style vary from caregiver to caregiver, like mom or dad, or is it generally the same across the board?
It can vary, especially if, in situations where the environments are different. So if you have separated parents, or you have a child that may be splitting time between, maybe in a foster placement, but is spending more time with the biological placement again, you can have different attachments with different caregivers. Each caregiver creates their own unique attachment with the child. And that can be another scenario where a child may have a non-secure attachment with a particular caregiver and then doesn't have an attachment disorder because they have a secure attachment with a different caregiver. Typically when you have two parents in the same home and they're, in general, they're on the same page with how they interact with that child, the attachments will be the same. there's a lot of different ways to get to a secure attachment style. So, as long as the child experiences quality support from those two caregivers, and the caregivers react consistently when the child is distressed, that will usually end up in a secure attachment, even if the styles can be different.
Okay. Any other questions?
Been really good questions.
Right, one more message, let's see. What is the condition called of a parent that doesn't feel connected to a child?
So there isn't a direct term for that. Now, oftentimes this happens if a parent is going through postpartum depression. One of the core symptoms of that is they will not feel connected to their child. But that feeling is not in and of itself a disorder. You can also see that in a situation where there's a temperamental mismatch. The other kind of phrase that goes along with it is the caregiver doesn't feel in tune with their child. They're just like, they feel like they're operating on two different wavelengths, using two different radio frequencies, so to speak. But if say we have a caregiver that says something like that, what we'll want to evaluate first and foremost is there postpartum depression or some kind of depressive disorder at play for the caregiver.
Michelle's asking, can that go on for the duration of the child's life?
Is it possible? Yes. I mean, certainly a lot of it depends on if the caregiver gets treatment. And if the caregiver does get treatment, and if it happens early enough, especially during the critical window, the outcome can be vastly different. So like if you have, a caregiver that identifies that lack of connectedness, maybe when the child's like 6 months old and they get treatment, and they're feeling better by say the time child's 9 or 10 months, they're still in that critical window, and a secure attachment can certainly develop from that.
And then she says, or Eugenia says, and maybe children are product of rape, sadly. Okay.
Like lack of attachment,
Dealing. Well, that can be one of that can certainly be one of those scenarios where there is, where the caregiver's history has a serious impact on their ability to connect with their child. And that might be a parent that's going, so one thing, so we mentioned postpartum depression. Another one we have to keep in mind is PTSD, because caregivers that have undergone trauma, perhaps in the birth of their child, and this could not necessarily just rape, but also if there was a traumatic birth, for example. So a parent has to undergo an emergency C-section, or there's a life-threatening occurrence that happens while the baby's being born, or the baby has to be in the NICU for several months, and the parents don't get a chance to hold that child. That can all lead to a disconnect, and we would be looking at both depression and PTSD as a potential source of treatment for the caregiver.
I just wanted to say with that, Joshua, like for instance, my mom, when she had my youngest sister, she was in a coma for several months. And she said that it got to a point that they would try to bring my sister into her room sometime to, try to, let her cry a little bit or whatever for my mom. But even when she came fully out of the coma, she was more attached to the nurse who was her main caregiver. So even then, that was kind of like weird, her trying to meet my mom. And then in turn, when even she brought her home, it was weird for us because we're like, she wasn't this little baby. She was 3 months old. So right. Even her trying to get used to us, it was like, who are all these people? Because she had a lot of siblings. So that whole thing with that as well.
Yeah, now that's actually that brings up a really good part of infant development related to attachment that I think it's important to put out there. So as I mentioned, the critical attachment window is 6 to 12 months. So what's happening during the first 6 months? And it's entirely normal for babies to not form attachments with anybody or to form some kind of superficial attachment with whoever's around them. So if a baby has been primarily interacting with nurses for 3 months, they are going to seem attached to some degree to those people because that's all they know. That's different from an attachment. That is not an actual psychological attachment that is developed yet. So, and I think that's important because, you know, for that scenario where, say, a parent maybe could not hold their child for 3 months and ends up taking them home and is like, I'm not in, like, this child doesn't seem to care who I am. That's actually normal. That has nothing to do with their NICU stay. That's because babies at that age don't develop secure attachments yet, and it will happen. And that can be very enlightening for caregivers because it allows them, like, because I mean, you would think at that point you can start to have a lot of self-doubt, self-guilt, blame because of the situation it is, or that they're a bad parent because their child's not attached to them. They shouldn't be at that age. The reason that oftentimes there is that connection is because the caregiver, you know, often, but even if it's like a single dad or a grandparent, that person is who the child relies upon for sustenance, which didn't, you know, if they're in the NICU, that's not how it works. So that activity of getting that, like, for the caregiver, of being able to provide that to the child is a really important bonding experience for the caregiver. But it is actually not part of developing an attachment for the child.
Okay. And then Kat is asking, what other attachment disorder?
Okay, I'm not going to go into details about it because I want to save something for it next time, but it's called disinhibited social engagement disorder. Feel free to look that up all you want. We'll talk about it next week, but essentially it's more about an expansion of our understanding of non-secure attachments that's led to that.
So it's 7:22. I just want to thank everybody this was a great group, for everybody coming in on time, for your great questions. That's what makes it a great training, because we learned from each other and from Dr. Russell. So with that, I want to remind you, I'm going to put in the chat again, Families Together's website. Please check it out. I will send out the post survey. I'm going to send it out to the whole group. Those of you that completed the please send back the post and we'll see what you learned. As this closes out, there will be a Families Together survey, which is really quick. It's, you know, multiple choice. So please take time to fill that out as well. And we have a cliffhanger here. So hopefully everybody will be back next week to join us for the next session on attachment.
And thanks again for handling the tech glitches.
Yeah, thanks. Before we go, I just have a little antidote to share regarding attachment. One of my adopted sons and I were speaking about running away. And he said, you know, Mom, if I had wanted to run away, I've done that a long time ago. And then it hit me, guess we're attached. So, yeah.
Yep. Attachment is the kind of process that is often behind the scenes. It sneaks up on people. You don't really realize it's happening.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay. Thank you all.
All right. Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you. Bye
Thanks a lot,
now.
everyone.
Next week.
Bye.
I should be able to go to the YouTube and find the links, right? And just send them out.
Yep.
I know when I was listening earlier, it connected right to my YouTube. So
Yep. Yeah, we
I
can
can
either send the links or you can just send them the slides because it should connect right through the slide.
okay. All right. I think you know, everything went well, except for that little bit of sound. So I'm gonna go ahead and send the post survey out, and we'll see you next week. If there's any other questions, let me know.
All right.
Thank you, Dr. Russell. It was
No
great.
problem. Thank you. I'll see you all next week.
Thank you, Doctor.